Okay, I have the privilege of introducing Siddharth Prakash, who's our first speaker in this session. Siddharth's going to speak about results of a multi-center clinical trial looking at exercise after aortic dissection.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be able to present our work. And as you can see, many of us in the room have been working on this, and with funding from the John Ritter Foundation. We all know that after dissection, our patients tend to have many physical and mental challenges, and one of the key ones that we hear from our patients in clinic is the difficulty in resuming normal activities, never mind exercise, just getting back to a baseline level of strength and fitness that they can carry out their daily lives. And this has become extremely important in, now that we're doing more preventative operations on young people who, as we have heard, should face a relatively normal lifespan. And now they're dealt this situation that they are not prepared for, and we're not doing the best job that we could to help them lead a high-quality, long life. And of course, most of the guidelines, as we heard from Shane this morning, are focusing on athletics, athletic participation, which is certainly valid for a subset, but most people don't care about that. They want to know, what can I do to get back to feeling the way I did before my dissection? And that's a very different level or kind of question to answer. And of course, most of the things, if we read the guidelines, this is the famous chart, everyone's at the lower left corner, right? That's very restrictive for a lot of people who are doing the things at the top and the right before the dissection. They want to know, can I ever do that again? And we don't have any way to really tell them that they can do that safely. So the first thing that we did in preparation for learning more about what the community is doing, because we knew people were out there doing activities that we restricted, and we worked with some groups who, dissection survivors, who were doing athletic events. And we wanted to know what kind of competitive athletics people were doing after dissection. So we created surveys and we sent them around to these, there's Facebook groups of people who post their activities and actually support each other. Some of them run marathons, you might have heard about these, and they're quite vocal online about their athletic participation. So we wanted to know, what kind of events were they doing? Did they have any adverse events? So this is the group. As you can see, many of them had dissections. Many of them had multiple segment aortic disease. Most of them were taking medications and being regularly followed, they said, by an aortic center. And this is their mean age at aortic dissection was 50, so kind of an early onset group. We didn't ask about heritable thoracic aortic disease in this survey. So these are the kind of activities they were doing. Now, keep in mind that we only asked about competitive athletic activities. So these are professional or timed events where there is some sort of stake. It's not recreational. So running or an Ironman were the most common ones. Then we found that many people were doing more aerobic things like cycling, but you can also see there were contact sports in there. Okay, so 8 of the 77 respondents to their survey said that they had at least one symptomatic event, either preparing for or during a competitive activity. The main ones, again, reflecting the percentage that people were doing, were running. And when we asked what the event was, it was mostly syncope or pre-syncope type symptoms. There was one case of an arrhythmia requiring hospitalization. It was an acute onset of AFib. But there was one case of chest pain, but no acute dissections that were proven on imaging, and no deaths. So this was actually kind of surprising to me. I might have expected a greater percentage of symptoms, but it does go to show that people are out there doing things, and we need to be aware of them as physicians in order to counsel. Now, when we looked at the individuals who had symptomatic episodes, it was related to the number of CV medications, and as you might expect, the higher number predicted more orthostatic type symptoms. And so this reflects, again, an issue with perhaps medication adjustment in this population. The other thing that we found is that the likelihood of a symptomatic episode during or after competition was directly related to the amount of training time and total activity time per week in this population, such that individuals that reported 150 or fewer than 200 total event training times per week were much more likely to have a symptomatic episode. So what we found is looking at the 5 years before and after dissection, there was a significant decline in competitive sports participation in this highly active group, that up to 20% of athletes did experience health episodes, and most of these were runners, and that many of these seem to be related to weekly exercise time or conditioning, and perhaps strategic changes to both preparation and CV medications could ameliorate some of these episodes. So based on that, we asked a more general group in the John Ritter Foundation how many of them were compliant with AHA recommendations for weekly activities, and as you can see, half of them were not getting 150 minutes per week of activities, and most of them reported that exercise or some questions related to exercise were their top priority, and asked for some help with it. So based on that, we designed a pilot study to observe patients while they exercised, showing that these exercises could be done safely in a controlled setting, and we wanted to then be able to export that to a home-based program that we could then use to guide these patients. So these are the exercises that we used. We had bicep curls, wall sits, hand grips, leg raises, bicycling, and treadmill. Now, when we set this up, we did it in our clinic, so we wanted to have it in a supervised facility, so we started doing it in our rehab facility where we've got nursing, and we could also measure their blood pressure during and after each exercise. So we would measure them twice at steady state during these exercises and then in between each exercise. And you can see we have a mixture intentionally of isotonic and isometric activities here. The idea was that these require relatively simple equipment, except for the bicycle. For most of the part, they could be done at home. They're low impact, so people with musculoskeletal issues could potentially do these. Again, simple equipment and a standardized protocol that we developed based on feedback from our initial cohort. So the idea, again, was to measure their blood pressure during and after each rep with an on-track ambulatory blood pressure monitor. These are the same kind that we use in clinic to assess longitudinal blood pressure. We had them also fill out questionnaires about their weekly activities and medications, and then we compared their blood pressures during exercise and recovery. And what we found initially is that our patients were able to complete the exercises. We compared 30 patients and healthy controls. And again, these are all comers. Half of them had dissections, half of them are being surveilled for aneurysms. We did not see any overall changes in blood pressure response to each exercise, as you can see here. But we did, again, note a strong relationship between fewer minutes of weekly activity, such that anything less than an hour per day was associated with hypertensive responses to exercise, defined here as greater than 180 millimeters of mercury on at least 2 of the 6 exercises, or 100 millimeters diastolic. One thing that we did notice with our patients is, again, this phenomenon that they would become lightheaded or dizzy immediately after exercise. So looking at the 3-minute recovery blood pressure in our healthy controls versus the individuals with TAD, we saw this drop in systolic blood pressure frequently with orthostatic symptoms, and again, this correlates with medication use. And we would counsel individuals to be very careful with their activities after completing the exercises for this reason. So we found that most people were able to safely and effectively perform moderate intensity exercises, and that the pressure response of our TAD patients was not significantly different than controls, and that actually increased activities did seem to greatly benefit this population, in that they had fewer hypertensive responses, which is what we're concerned with as clinicians. So then the goal was, based on that, we got funding for a pilot trial from the John Ritter Foundation to expand this into a larger multi-center cohort. And again, we wanted to focus on blood pressure responses, self-reported activities, and then mental health, because we thought that one measurable outcome of this could be improved confidence of the patient cohort to engage in regular activities. And of course, to confirm the safety in a broader population. So these are enrollments: Michigan, St. Louis, and Houston. And the idea was that we would enroll people who had a thoracic aortic dissection, could have been type A or type B, at least 3 months after their acute phase, so that they could become eligible. The rub was that we wanted to observe them directly in an in-person training session. So they had to be able to attend an in-person training session at the enrollment site. And this was the trial design. So again, at enrollment, they would fill out a consent form and questionnaires about their weekly activity habits. They would get a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. We would measure orthostatic vital signs, and then we would randomize them in a 1-to-1 ratio to either this guided exercise arm or usual care. Usual care being a pamphlet that we would give out in clinic about activities that are safe to do and some provider counseling. Guided exercise, they would go to this one-on-one in-person exercise training session where we would walk with them through the exercise circuit. And then they would go home where they would attempt to replicate those exercises with virtual follow-up visits at 1, 3, and 9 months. And then the final study visit at 1 year where they would repeat the questionnaires and blood pressure. So right now, and in addition, we use the 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure to look at things like nocturnal dipping, blood pressure variability, and control of hypertension, which is one of the outcomes of the trial. At our site, we also use central arterial waveform analysis because we're interested in pulse augmentation and stiffness as a result of exercise, which has been shown to be influenced by these. So this is the data for the first 81 participants. They were well randomized, which is what this shows, and you can see that many of them were around 3 to 4 years out from their dissection, mostly type A, some type Bs, and most of them were on beta blockers. So what we found was that in this pilot study that it was substantially difficult to recruit patients because we had this barrier that they had to be able to attend an in-person visit. And this was, and so we ended up enrolling 95 participants who completed study visits. And the major reasons why people were excluded were that they were unable to attend the in-person visits, unable to access exercise equipment at home, or some physical limitations that prevented them from completing all 6 of the exercises. So, but that was a minority. Most of it was due to the travel requirement. And then we looked at PROMIS scores, PROMIS being an important metric to measure mental health domains. And we found, as expected, that scores for anxiety, chronic pain, and impairment of participation in social activities were mildly increased in this cohort. So this is where we are now in terms of follow-up visits. So this is the 1, 3, and 9-month visits. We're wrapping up the middle and late follow-up for this cohort. It should be completed this fall by the end of October. So all participants were able to complete the in-person exercise protocol. We did have a few hiccups where there were high blood pressures and we had to delay completion, but there were no serious adverse events. Moderate intensity guided exercise was safe in this group. Most of the participants in the exit interviews reported increased confidence to engage in the exercise. And we also used a Borg scale to measure effort, and we found that this reliably predicted large changes in systolic and diastolic blood pressure, such that if individuals maintained a medium effort in the Borg scale, they were largely able to avoid very high swings in blood pressure. And we also found that grip strength improved by 20% in the guided exercise group within a few months of starting the protocol. So the other thing that we found was that we saw markers like this on the 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. So this individual, when we put the blood pressure cuff on in the clinic, had normal blood pressure. But you can see that there are dramatic changes over the course of the day. And this is what we found is the best single predictor of exertional hypertension. So 24-hour ambulatory, but not clinic blood pressure, predicted a hypertensive response. And when we did this, we also showed that there were abnormalities beyond just blood pressure, like reverse nocturnal dipping and ambulatory hypertension, even with the normal clinic blood pressure. So, and then when we looked at this in multivariate analysis, it was the variation in the blood pressure on the 24-hour ABPM and peak daytime blood pressure, but not clinic blood pressure, that predicted adverse hemodynamic effects to exercise. So this is an argument to use 24-hour ABPM to risk stratify individuals who might be hypertensive or you're concerned about that before they exercise. So the top lessons that we learned so far from this pilot study is that the barriers to enrollment clearly created selection bias such that it removed individuals who were not as highly motivated, and the individuals who did participate had more positive attitudes, therefore making it harder for us to show a benefit from the mental health perspective. To be representative, we need to reach patients where they are. 100% home-based protocols. I don't think periodic video visits are enough. We need frequent bidirectional communication and feedback hopefully with an app-based format with central adjudication, so we can give patients real-time information about their progress in the protocol. And that would best be accomplished by wearables. And finally, we should definitely target individuals who are unable to access rehabilitative services after aortic dissection. That's an increasingly large group due to insurance purposes, and these people are being left behind. So in the future trial, that's what we hope to address. I'd like to thank the John Ritter Foundation for funding the pilot trial, all of my collaborators, including the many people in the room, and our UTH study team, particularly Kayla House, who did a lot of this work. Thank you.